Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support.
Very well to that last one because we're talking about causality in one dimension, and what I want to talk about in this parallel here is talking about causal hierarchy in multiple dimensions and talking about directionality of causal and the type in our language of system dynamics. This is another one of those presentations where I don't say this is the answer. This is an invitation to start a dialogue, and I have some initial thoughts, but I'm hoping a lot of folks join in expanding our causal language. Let's see here. Here we go. So begin with a thought experiment. What causes a plane to fly? Just think in your head, what are some of the causes that causes a plane to fly? It's a thought experiment from Ellis. Well, there's many simultaneous causes that exist at the same time. We can talk about physical causes. There's an air molecule crossing over the wings, creates lift. This is a very practical explanation. Without it, it wouldn't fly. But there's also local causes. There's a pilot flying it. You know, there's somebody in front. There's an airline that scheduled that flight, maybe not this summer, but, you know, generally airlines schedule flights and expect people to join them. But there's also system causes, right? Passengers desire to travel. Businesses have models that fulfill this need by creating airplanes. Manufacturers build airplanes. Somewhere along the way, an engineer designed to fly. These are all simultaneous and true causes of why a plane flies. But these causes have directions. And if we begin to think of directionality with causes, we can start with system causes and saying those are top-down causes. Those come down through the top of the system on why that plane is flying. But the pilot, that's a local cause. That's very, you know, at the same time the plane is flying, a same level cause. Those physical causes, those are bottom up. And we begin to see that there could be directionality in all of these simultaneous causes. Now, this is nothing I'm going to say here is new because of me. It's because other fields, physics, biology, are grappling with these issues of causality. And I'm bringing that language here because they talk about top-down versus bottom-up. And yet, how many terms do we have in system dynamics or methods that can describe different directions and types of causality? Right? When I talk about the other fields, these are the terms they use. These are categories. There's a category of hierarchical terms, bottom-up terms, top-down transition terms, experimental terms, and all of these terms that are ways of describing causality. In system dynamics, from the very beginning, go back to the very beginning, go to principles and systems, and you will find that causality is an inherent, essential premise of system dynamics, but we usually only assume it's one type. It's an arrow, or direction, or cause and effect, and that one type. I'm not going to go over all these today. There is an entire hour-and-a-half presentation online YouTube. It's at the front of this if you want to pause it. There's a paper I'll be posting after. We go through all these terms and bring up examples, but I'm going to go through two sets of them in red just to show how we're not necessarily not doing this. We're just not calling it, and some of the things we might want to decide to do. So when it comes to top-down causal mechanisms, we're just going to pick a few here. Algorithmic. Higher variables influence lower variables through structure, boundary conditions, and initial conditions. Think about a computer, right? The application software that lays on the top of that sends instructions to the operating system that activates switches and circuits in the hardware, which then generates an effect which comes back up to the software. That is an algorithmic example of top-down causation. Non-adaptive information control. This is one we use all the time. And in fact, we're using it right here in Germany right now because it involves the air conditioner. Right? I set a goal of the temperature I want, and a simple feedback loop attempts to adapt to that goal. Here's an example, very simple, from a traditional burst population's death, where food scarcity is the exogenous goal. It's a negative loop feedback with an exogenous goal. That's non-adaptive information. It will seek that. We know the behavior. It will seek that goal. It will settle on it, and it will stay there. Some more examples. Adaptive selection. This is when many entities interact, followed by selection of best performing entities. We understand this very well from evolution. This is something that we're very familiar with, but it is a form of causation. It is absolutely a form of causation. We'll get into an example when I talk about some of the experimental terms of how evolution demonstrates this causation, and we might want to use it in our models. But the next one, adaptive information control, this is where you take the non-adaptive information control, but with adaptive goals. Now, we know this when we make a model endogenous, that previous simple feedback loop, when we take that exogenous goal and make it endogenous simply by linking it back that food scarcity is linked to food consumption, which is linked to population. This is now an adaptive information control, but there's a more complex version you use anytime you turn on a streaming service. Netflix is trying to use an algorithm to figure out your particular preferences, and if you watch Stranger Things and Parks and Rec, it may suggest The Office. And that is, it's goal seeking, but it's doing it based off an adaptive algorithm based on your specific criteria. The last one gets tricky. Intelligent causation. This is a special case of adaptive information control where individuals or groups arbitrarily select symbolic representations. They're using language, they're using math, they're using designs, they're using pictures. It's distinguished by this abstract symbolism and that it tends to be irreducible. Let's go back to that airplane. We say a top-down cause is that the airplane was designed to fly that way. That's intelligent causation. People sat down and thought, how do we get this airplane to fly? But you cannot reduce the design of an airplane to any one person's mental model. There is no one schematic. My father worked for Boeing for 30 years. Airplanes have thousands of designs and diagrams and supply chain contracts and all sorts of information consolidated in this airplane design. And it's incredibly complex, but it does have a causation from the top down. But this is a physical kind of manifestation, but there's also a lot that we run into system dynamics that are not physical. What is the value of money? Right? No one sits down and, well, if you don't believe the conspiracy theories, at least no one sits down and arbitrarily says that value will be this. What is the value of cryptocurrency? What is the value of the dollar? What's the exchange rate? These are lots of people using intelligent decision making, but it's coming together as a group to determine the value of money as a construct. And you can't reduce it back to find who did what and reverse engineer it. Relevant to this conference specifically, social construction of roles, norms, and expectations is a great example of top-down causation. We talked about inequality in the plenary session, and Professor Sturman mentioned yellow lining and red lining. I study violence and instability. I've looked at the homicides in Chicago. If you map the homicide rates in Chicago down to a granular level, you look at streets and neighborhoods, you will find wide inequality within Chicago where some places have a per capita homicide rate, might be 10, might be 20. Others have hundreds per year because there's such a concentration of violence. Now, if you lay that map over a map of redlining, yellow lining, and highway demolition projects from the 1950s, it almost perfectly overlays. There is a structural effect, the top-down causation of someone deciding that we're going to, these racist systems that are socially constructed norms on perceived other led to a bottom-up causation, physically disrupting the communities and creating conditions that lead to violence. This other forms of inequality is, these represent these top-down because we talk about what is gender, what is this construction. These are where social constructs come into the causal discussion. Selected experimental terms, again in the paper we go through all these terms in a little bit more detail. But manifestation is a discrete instantiation of one phenomena among a class of phenomena within a contingent channel. That sounds complicated. I'll get to it. It will make sense. But that's a manifestation. And this, again, this is our three-dimensional causal hierarchy now. A proposition is one of many of those simultaneous causes that we locate by direction, class, rank, and causal character. So let's say that proposition is the background color of the environment within which a bear lives, right? If that value of that proposition is it's brown, it's earth tones, it's more like this area, you may have brown bears. That's an example of that evolutionary selection that we talked about. It creates a downward channel or a niche within which brown bears are favored and you will have brown fare, but you change the contingent value of that proposition. Ice, glaciers, snow, that downward channel shifts and brown bears are no longer selected, but white polar bears. And so a channel represents the contingent values of a specific contingency that will allow manifestations to arise, exist, or not exist. And these are great things we can do with simulation tests. A contingency experiment is a simulation test that you can run to see what combination of propositions or what values of contingencies will allow create the manifestations we observe in our reference modes. How do we cause those to come into being? How do we know those exist? We did this work with terrorism and radicalization, which I just presented downstairs, and used this to perhaps settle a 20-year-old debate because what the researchers were looking at were two separate channels where in different manifestations, a brown bear and a polar bear, and one guy saying, hey, it's a brown bear, the other saying, hey, it's a polar bear, and they didn't recognize the contingent values of the system they were looking at, and therefore debated when we said, hey, if you adjust these contingencies, we can replicate both. And that's the causal explanation that's causing this phenomenon. So how do you integrate it into modeling? As I just presented downstairs and you can find online, this is a complicated CLD. I'm not going to go through it, but this is a causal loop diagram where we wanted to assert cause and identify those simultaneous cause. Take a causal loop diagram, flip it on its side, extend it vertically, and you now have a three-dimensional space within which you can map top-down and bottom-up effects. Thank you. And so the same thing, you can now begin to test, and there in the paper it describes some of the tests that are out there to determine what is the correct use of causal hierarchy, how do you test whether the system is running in a top-down or bottom-up way, how do you isolate these causes. But I wouldn't recommend stopping at the causal loop stage. Take those findings, go into a simulation and test them. We did an entire paper on contingency analysis where we ran all these contingency experiments to understand it's somewhat like sensitivity, but it's not exactly, because what you're doing is let me put this, there we go. So we built that simulation model, hierarchically represented. Each of those levels represents a hierarchical level in the simulation. And when you run those tests, it's not quite sensitivity because you're not just picking parameters and seeing what, I mean, that you still need to do that. But this is a very specific causal assertion that says this will create a channel within which we'll find a manifestation. And you need to have a basis for why you're testing that, because otherwise if you test it and you find it, you may reverse engineer a justification that, what is the causation? So these are not tools to be used in isolation. And these are very primitive tools because this is what I made up during the middle of my dissertation to answer something about violence, but it's pulling from these other fields. My ask of the community is, how can we get this discussion broadened and get all the great tool builders and methodologists to start looking at this and incorporating, really expanding our vocabulary, improving our language, grammar, and syntax about causality. And I'll leave this up during the questions because this has all the sources, it's going to be recorded so you can get it, but I think that's it for time, so.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have time for questions. Again, I'm going to look online first. The only people I can see with hands up are the people with cameras on. So if you are shy today, make yourself known if you have a question. Okay. Failing that, immediately to the right of our screen, Jeff Traylor,
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this. This is super interesting. I guess my question is, am I interpreting this right? So in data analytics and big data and using artificial intelligence to sort through relationships and searching for an algorithm to find causal relationships is perhaps an application of this. That by understanding these channels, you could direct the search more effectively for the right channel or right type of cause in order to make connections between variables. Is that an example of how this might be?
It might be. I'm not really a specialist in artificial intelligence, but I know one of the problems with black box artificial intelligence is understanding the causes of how it came to its answer. And if there's some interconnection or discussion between a simulation model, and I think Sandia had a poster about doing this with some combined artificial intelligence simulation. I think there's a lot of richness in general for starting to include those techniques. And as a sort of brute force search within a channel, you might find a lot of things that haven't manifested yet. You can do that through other means, but I certainly think that would be possible to improve channel. We did it through classical, what we use is sensitivity analysis methods, but we used them in the context of a contingency experiment. So we were using existing methods within Stella. But I think if you were to power this up, that might be an idea.
okay, I still have nothing online, so Aurelio?
Hi, thank you. Have you by any chance mapped it against the Aristotle for different causes? I mean, it seems to be overlapping.
If you go to the paper, we directly, part of the test is to, I didn't get into detail, but in addition, when we talk about, there's directionality, location and hierarchy, a specific rank within the hierarchy, and the type. The type is a modern version coming from Falcone of Aristotle's 4. Teleological cause, physical, all those. So it is directly in there as a way of testing, and it helps you think about how does this cause matter in the whole system? For what purpose, in our question, does violent radicalization, what is the purpose? And that helped us formulate that. So definitely it's in the paper.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There's one behind you.
Please.
Yes, I have a question. Very interesting presentation. I have a question. Can you take into account manipulated knowledge, manipulated information or a linear pillar of knowledge, or even lobbying.
What was that last word?
Yeah, lobbying,
Lobby? Like political lobby?
political lobbying.
Yeah, so the question for those online, in case you didn't hear, is can you take unknown knowledge, or can you take unknown actors and do a political lobbying? We were, not exactly, but we were using this on violent radicalization that leads to terrorism. So it's a very ambiguous environment. They're not doing, quarterly releases and public presses, and it sort of happens in the shadows. It's not a direct copy to what I would hope it's not to the lobbying groups, but you think about this can be used, but I think part of that is we had a very good literature study of what the theories were that could give us these simultaneous causes. I think what you're asking is, it's very hard. I think it'd be risky to generate random simultaneous causes just because I thought so. You want to ground that in data, experiment, evidence, some sort of validated theory. Then you may take 20 or so of those causes, and then you can begin working for them. I think it would be dangerous to sort of assert a causation without having some evidence to back that up. But once you have those, this method lets you go through and at least describe and talk about where that might lead.
Please.
Yeah, so about this hierarchy blocks, how do you define the level there? So like,
Sure.
what makes one variable in a causal loop diagram have a higher level than another one?
The question is, how do we define the hierarchies? This is in the video in the paper, but basically Ellis defines a hierarchy as having think of it in like system dynamics, a common class of problems. Elements in that hierarchy operate by the same rules, which are different than other elements. A simple example is, first level hierarchy might be people. I could have ranks, and we're talking business. I could have ranks in that first class, that is worker, supervisor, manager, but they're all operating within the rules of people. That's one hierarchy. The next hierarchy is businesses. Businesses operate from a different set of rules that is separate and distinguishable by people, non-overlapping, but is influenced from the bottom up in clear ways. Within businesses, you could have different ranks, but above businesses might be markets. Above markets might be economies. You're basically creating a hierarchy where these things exist and have influence, but they have their own rules of operation, which are not really overlapping with the upper or higher levels, but yet can be defined for that level of the hierarchy.
But then, if I can continue, do you then think that it's similar to dimensions like time and space? Like, is there also a dimension in objects or something?
Well, the dimension of time, I refer to Khalid Said's slicing complex problems and building reference modes. Time is always a dimension in complex systems that I think you have to account for, and you are going to see these slices of behavior modes in each class, because each class will have its own behavior mode, and that gets into sort of how you disentangle complex behavior modes to create clear slices. I think of them as dimensions, as sort of dimensions of causality, but I think time, by the way, the assumed premise here is I'm not arguing the argument whether causation even exists, which gets to the arrow of time and physics like that. I'm avoiding that discussion entirely by simply saying, if causality exists, this is one thing we can do. So I'm getting away from does time exist or causality exist. Thank you very much.
Okay, and that's all we have time for.
Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.